Good evening, everybody. The Archaeological Society Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology University are delighted to see so many participants with us today at this, the second in the series of talks for 2020-2021. I can see that there are many participants from overseas, so a special welcome to them. For those who don't know me, I'm Patricia Camilleri, President of the Archaeological Society Malta, and I shall be mediating this evening's session. I would like to ask you to make sure that you mute yourselves so that we don't have any echo issues, or perhaps dogs barking in the background and such like, as often happens on these Zooms. Video is totally optional. You can open or close it as you like, but please note that this lecture is being recorded. All lectures for this coming season will be in collaboration, a collaboration between the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University, Malta, and the Archaeological Society Malta. Thanks go to the head of the department at the University, Dr. John C. Betts, and to Professor Nicholas Vella, who is always the linchpin between the society and the department. Just a word about how we shall proceed this evening. I'll be introducing our guest speakers, Dr. Isabelle, Vella, Gregory, and Dr. Michael Brass, then turning the virtual floor over to them. Please do ask your questions on chat, and you can do that throughout their talk. You find the chat either at the bottom or the top of your screens. You can do it anytime during the talk, and I shall be monitoring those questions as you give them, as you put them. And I'll ask our speakers to answer at least some of those queries at the end as time allows. So let's move on. A quick word about our speakers, a very reductive bio. Dr. Michael Brass is co-director of the University College London, University of Khartoum NCAM expedition to the Southern Gezira. He is an honorary research fellow at the Institute of Archaeology at the University College London, where he also obtained a PhD in archaeology. Dr. Isabelle Vella Gregory is affiliate scholar at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeology at the University of Cambridge and deputy director of the Jebel Moya project. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. Vella Gregory and Dr. Brass.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen then and start the presentation. Thank you so much for inviting us for this. We're really excited to be here. I know there are some of our Sudanese colleagues who are probably in the background or about to join us. And to them we say, Assalamu alaikum. Assada wa ya sayyidat min al-Sudan, shukran li hudurakum. So thank you for coming. For the rest of us, just be aware that the lecture will contain some images of human remains in excavation. And we will also be talking about some rather difficult topics as we go along. So this is basically the structure of our lecture. Today we're going to tell you a bit about the site and the history, how it came about, etc., etc. So over to Mike. No, honey, that one.
Yep. Many of you will be familiar with the archaeology of the different Nubian states, starting with Kerma, then the Napatan and Meroitic kingdoms with their famous pyramids. Of these, the kingdom which stretched further south was the Meroitic. It existed from around 350 BC to AD 350. Its direct political rule, however, did not extend far south of Khartoum. Our site of Jebel Moya is far south, indeed 250 kilometers south of Khartoum in the southern Gezira plain. It is bounded by the Blue and White Niles, which are around 30 kilometers to either side. The site itself is in a mountain range, and the valley which we just call Jebel Moya for shorthand, is 10.4 hectares in size. Our field survey estimates that Henry Wellcome excavated 2/5 of the valley, with 3/5 containing unexcavated and archaeologically viable deposits. Here is a view of the site. It is a multi-phase site with deposits of more than 3,100 human burials. The work done for my PhD had hypothesized 3 phases. Phase 1, late 6th millennium BC, phase 2 of around 1800 to 800 BC, and phase 3, late 1st millennium BC until the mid 1st millennium AD. However, later we will take you through the evolving chronology and how the current excavations are changing my previous interpretations and are impacting more broadly upon Sudanese archaeology. First, however, we need to situate Wellcome's expedition in its social and historical contexts.
So we begin with a sort of brief history of Sudan at the time Wellcome would have gone to Jebel Moya. In 1899, Britain and Egypt reached an agreement under which Sudan had what was called a condominium government. The Brits insisted this is not a colony, but it functioned suspiciously like a colony. And the way this came about is Britain wanted to reestablish control in Egypt, or more precisely control of the Nile. You see here on screen part of the beautiful blue Nile as we are driving towards Jebel Moya. And so Kitchener, Herbert Kitchener, led a number of military campaigns in Sudan. And in 1898, he declared victory after the Battle of Omdurman, which was essentially a mass slaughter of the Sudanese. And we're talking over 15,000 people slaughtered here. And in 1899, Britain and Egypt reached the condominium agreement. And in 1914, Reginald Wingate became the military governor of Sudan. And Kitchener wandered off to South Africa, where he established concentration camps for the Boers. Now, before this, of course, there had been many foreign visitors to Sudan and a number of anthropologists. And, you know, the British administration loved documenting the so-called quirks of natives everywhere, including on the Maltese Islands. Henry Wellcome was one of the first civilians to visit after the slaughter at Omdurman. Now, he's interesting. He was born in poverty in America, but he spent most of his life in England, where he founded the pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome with his partner Silas Burroughs. And Wellcome was primarily an entrepreneur. He sought to commercialize pharmaceuticals, which was a strange thing to do in England at the time. But he also fancied himself as a man of culture and a philanthropist. And his first interests in the Sudan were concerned with welfare, pestilence, and disease. And he set up the Wellcome Tropical Research Labs in Khartoum. And like most people, Wellcome saw Africa as one country and as a land of opportunity. Now, when he establishes Jebel Moya, he hires an enormous workforce. He demands an extensive license for the entire Gezira plain. This was turned down, by the way. We got a more extensive license to dig than Henry did, which pleases us. And you're about to see so many people working in this camp. Not a single one of them was from the village of Jebel Moya. He came in already suspicious of the natives. They were already not fond of him because this man waltzes in and disturbs the peace and quiet. And we can pick up on that later when we talk about heritage. Now, Wellcome had this view of benevolence that is deeply rooted in British imperialism, and which in turn is rooted in certain views of Christianity. Now here I have to point out that over a third of the Sudanese political service was made up of the sons of clergymen, and not just the sons of clergymen, but the sons of clergymen from the upper classes. In short, this idea of being visibly benevolent was extremely important, a big song and dance. And this is, I mean, at the outset, Wellcome styled himself as the Pasha. I'm serious, that's what he called himself. He even had this medallion struck And he used this logo on all his correspondence and media and things like that. So on one side, it just says Jebel Moya, and on the other side, there's a rather terrible graphic of the mountain. Now, he eventually builds a big village for the workers and establishes sanitary conditions. Again, this is all in line with his beliefs. He also imposed many conditions on his men, including daily drills, physical exercises, and participation in English field sports and other amusements. Not content with his efforts, he had a sermon read to all men on parade after evening roll call on April 28, 1913, and he got this Sheikh Makia Boheras to read the sermon, in which the Sheikh reminds men that God has sent the Honorable Master Mr. Welcome, who's improving their lives and is a kind father who loves them heartily. And this is disturbing on many levels, because this is even by the sort of lax 1900 standards of what's right and wrong, there's something about this that's not quite right. And when we take a closer look, we realize that his camp had a number of rules that were very different. For example, European workers signed a contract. The person, which would be Henry, is referred to as the employer. It's not particularly restrictive by sort of late Victorian, early Edwardian standards. The natives, in inverted commas, which included Sudanese and Egyptian workers, signed an indenture in which they had to swear to God to abide by the rules. This was one, he imposed a number of conditions. For example, Europeans were allowed to consume alcohol, the locals were not because of their religious beliefs, but because he didn't want them to. And, you know, his treatment of workers caused a lot of disquiet. There was a terrible incident when one of his big burly men, white European men, beat up a black guy for no reason. And it got so bad that Reginald Wingate got involved in this. But it was a case of, you know, that everyone quietly swept it under the carpet, because the conclusion was, well, you know, I'd rather they didn't beat up people, but I can't really discipline them in front of the natives. That's a word I really hate, by the way. Anyway, at Jebel Moya, welcome. This is, for example, this is the House of the Boulders. You'll see it a bit. He appointed a man from Ecuador called Julian Sergio Uribe as the camp commandant. He'd met him while he was in Quito. Uribe was in trouble because he was a former political prisoner, and he left with welcome. Uribe stayed there till 1938. I took that photo. That is he left a commemorative plaque before he left Sudan completely. Welcome was also very keen on new technologies. And so O.G.S. Crawford, who many of you will know for his Wessex from the air and pioneering the use of aerial photography for British archaeology, visited Jebel Moya, and they came up with this contraption, which is essentially a kite camera. And it took some rather good photos. There you can see that's one of the photos of the camp. Those are tents that he built to house the workers. And here's another couple of aerial photos. I mean, rather remarkable when you remember this is around 1911. Welcome was also keen to foster many relationships with important people. And so while Kitchener was still in the Sudan, he arranged a visit. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will notice some white bits on these photos. I'll tell you about them in a second. In fact, let's look at this rather horrific photo. What you see here are Kitchener and all the greats are visiting. The men at the bottom that you see are excavating, but you know, the placement of the photo, this is all highly orchestrated. Everything about Henry Welcome is highly orchestrated. And the white shiny bits that you see on the jallabiyas, what they did was, this is a copy, one of the photos, they would print them, touch them up with pigments, and then print them again. sort of early photo manipulation. There's an entire archive on this. Do you know why there's something blue appearing on my screen, by the way? Wellcome also fostered relations with big archaeologists, amongst them George Reisner, who at the time was considered revolutionary in Egyptian archaeology because he dug very methodically. Reisner came to Jebel Moya and excavated there for a little bit, and it really lent Wellcome a lot of kudos. And there you can see Reisner visiting with his wife and another woman who I don't know yet who she is, but it's quite interesting because Wellcome had a strict no women rule in the camp, but obviously rules could be changed. And here's another great photo, Wellcome, Reisner and Crawford down by the Nile, this, not in Jebel Moya, up to something. Wellcome never returned to the Sudan after 1914. He wanted to, but things were different after the First World War and his health was failing and he passed away in 1936 without ever returning. Publication of the site would only see the light of day in 1949 by Frank Addison. And after this, Jebel Moya all but disappears from the archaeological narrative until Mike appears.
Up until the start of my PhD in 2008, this is just a bit of background, I was involved in Southern African, pre-dynastic Egyptian and Saharan archaeology. Kevin MacDonald at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, he had been my supervisor from 2003 to 2004. His wife, Rachel Hutton MacDonald, had worked on the teeth from Wellcome's expedition as part of her doctorate in the late 1990s. It was Kevin who I credit with bringing Jebel Moya to my attention. Now, given the variable nature of British colonialism, which I was familiar with firsthand from my homeland of South Africa, I was conscious of both the history and nature of Wellcome's work and the long-term necessity to situate his work in its proper context. This means not only engaging with the archaeological material, but also working in close partnership with the local inhabitants, which Isabelle will talk about later. The majority of Wellcome's materials, including the skeletal data and excavation records, were shipped to the United Kingdom. Frank Addison published the Archaeological report in 1949, while the physical anthropological remains, which are curated at the Duckworth Laboratory, University of Cambridge, were published in 1955. Subsequently, there have been a few studies of note. One was the revisiting of the issue of chronology in the early 1990s by Rudolf Gerhardt, a German. He did not reinvestigate any of the expedition records, however, or the curated assemblage or undertake any kind of radiocarbon dating. Another, amongst others, was a population affiliation study using dental characteristics. That was Rachel's dissertation. Despite the positional and material nature of the site, no attempt had previously been made to elucidate the nature of social organization as reflected in the mortuary assemblages. This was the subject of my PhD. Now, central to improving the understanding and the stratigraphic and understanding the stratigraphic complexity of Jebel Moya and to subsequently decoding the intersite variation in material culture was the establishment of a secure chronology. Classes of pottery assemblages can be sensitive chronological indicators. Attribute-based approaches, which work particularly well with handmade ceramic vessels, assess culturally and temporally sensitive markers to provide a better view of evolutionary change. These attributes include motor actions, tool usage, etc., which allow for subsequent sorting to identify trends and generate statistically derived topologies termed attribute clusters. The application of such a textured approach permits archaeologists to move beyond mundane and, in my opinion, inadequate descriptions such as red burnished ware, dotted wavy line, or rocker stamp. 3 assemblages were determined from the British Museum collection. You see on screen here is, these are, for the next couple of slides, these are from the British Museum collection. This one is termed assemblage 1. This is in the Palace, kind of inaccurately in my opinion, of Sudanese archaeology. It's termed late Mesolithic pottery. It is from the late 6th millennium BC. Decoration on these assemblage sherds are stamped and pivoted comb, and there is one impressed cordrat roulette. The paste predominantly features sand, usually augmented with bone and mica. There is no burnishing. Assemblage 2, the middle assemblage. These sherds are comprised of thick, everted, and relatively thinner, simple rooms with dragged comb and fine spatula stamped chevrons, as well as fine spatula stamped impressions on the lip. The motifs appear on the outer surface of the lips. The temper comprises coarse grit and sand with mica sometimes present. Burnishing and slipping are present. The room angles show predominantly open vessels with some closed forms. There are a few sherds with zoned motifs with infill geometric forms, although the vast majority are non-zoned. For assemblage 3, the latest in the sequence, sherds are generally highly burnished and slipped. There are sherds featuring both thin, simple rooms as well as thin, everted rooms. Most are open vessels. Their decorative motifs were made using stamped comb, stylus incisions, and impressed cord. There are occasional examples of cord wrap roulettes, impressed, not rolled. Some sherds have motifs on the interior. Critically, motifs, apart from those along the lip of vessels, all occur as part of zone forms. Mica temper predominates in the paste with some bone. Samples from 6 sherds, 3 each from assemblages 2 and 3, were prepared for optical dating of coarse-grained quartz extracted from specimens supplied by the British Museum. New OSL dating techniques can now more accurately indicate the time the ceramic was fired and has been shown to provide similar accuracy to AMS dating of organic remains in pottery. Sample preparation and luminescence measurements were conducted at the Research Laboratory for Archaeology and the History of Art at Oxford University. Although the OSL dates have very large standard error deviations, there are no overlaps in the respective dates from the assemblage 2 and assemblage 3 sherds. The results indicate that there were 3 broad temporal phases. The sherds assigned to assemblage 1 were not directly dated due to the need to obtain clusters of dates on the more numerous 2nd and 3rd assemblages. The dating of assemblage 3 covers the Middle and Late Meroitic periods, as well as the aftermath of the breakup of the Meroitic state, which had possible trading stations down the Blue and White Niles. It is also to this phase that the vast majority, if not all, of the burials were assigned for my PhD. The next step was to establish the extent to which settlement remains were present alongside the mortuary remains in order to understand the nature of the use of the site. The figure on screen covers only a limited sector of the excavated valley, the southwest, because field notes detailing type and stratigraphic positioning for these features were only found by Addison for this area of the valley. The 2nd to 3rd florins listed are in fact clay impregnated with calcium carbonate, which lent it their white color. This next slide shows a calcium carbonate feature in better detail, and it also shows mud plastering from a wattle and dub structure and a stretch of hardened paving. Despite some errors, the stratigraphical positions of the habitation remains documented by Addison meant that they were habitation remains in likely association with all phases of the occupation. Returning to the burials themselves, the slide shows the breakdown of Welcome's burials in the different excavated areas of the valley and the percentage of each which have accompanying burial goods. This next slide compares the sexing done by the original field anthropologist to the resexing by the bioanthropologist at the Duckworth Laboratory on the extant remains. Now, the original bioanthropological study did not compile data on population demography, health, or diet. Rachel Hutton-MacDonald examined such issues in her dissertation, which came from 1999. She published dental samples from ethnographically and archaeologically known hunter-gatherer, pastoralists, and agriculturalist populations to determine the non-dietary uses of the teeth of the Jebel Moya population through dental wear analysis. The Jebel Moya incidence of dental caries was 0.2% compared to the 15.1% of agricultural Nubia to the north. Furthermore, there are several cattle figurines in non-burial contexts. Hutton-MacDonald therefore aligned Jebel Moya with the pastoralists. Among the analyses which I did, I looked to determine the spatial configuration for richer burials and less rich burials. 2 tests were run against the burials of each sector of the cemetery. First, the spacing of the richer burials, and second, the spacing of richer burials against less rich burials. For the first test on slide, the spatial distribution of the richer burials shows no significant patterning, with no rules determining the distance separating the richer burials. However, an interesting spatial phenomenon in terms of the distribution of the richest burials versus poorer burials was observed uniquely for the northeast sector in the second test. There is some inhibition between richer and poorer burials at distances of up to 20 meters, where the line representing the data value dips below the randomization envelope. Therefore, there are fewer poorer burials than expected at short distances from the richest burials, but a greater number of poorer burials than expected beyond. In other words, while the position of a richer burial was alive in the memory of the inhabitants, poorer people were not buried close to them. Generally, a common element of differentiation lies in the orientation of the body in select graves compared to other clusters of graves or sections of a cemetery in order to demarcate status, wealth, or other social standings. For the northeast sector at Jebel Moya, the most rich burials were compared to the other burials with recorded cardinal coordinates. These rich burials fall within the range of the cardinal variations, and so directionality cannot be used as any kind of distinguishing factor. However, there is variation in the reconstructed surface levels from which the graves were most likely dug. The level of the most rich burials could be reconstructed and coincides with the rise and decline of the peak period of burial activity in the sector. The time of the rich burials was assemblage 3. So what has been exhibited are deliberate, intentional burial behavioral patterns with a portion of the cemetery delineated from a particular moment in time to a sector of the population who commanded enough respect and status to be actively spatially distinct from those individuals deposited in less rich graves. Ultimately, it was hypothesized that the vast majority of the burials coincided during the time of assemblage 3 from the late 1st millennium BC until the middle of the 1st millennium AD, and that the layout of the cemetery was established at the outset of this phase. And now on to Isabelle.
Yes, so on to Netflix season 1. That's the location of our trenches over there. Now, it's worth pointing out that we excavated, there are 4 main geological strata that I show you with that we term A, B, C, and D very imaginatively. We excavate in 10 centimeter spits so that we can keep the control. And we've also undertaken an extensive flotation program. So, oh dear, here we go. Here we go. This is trench 2. Here you can see the strata very clearly. It's brilliant because there's just 4 clear strata. Okay, here you can only see 3. But, you know, I spent so many hours at Tassilj doing section drawings that drove me insane. And then to come and find this, it's brilliant. Now, trench 2 is one of our favorite trenches. What you're seeing here, that was only in season 1 and the deepest trench in season 1. And it was richest in finds from all kinds. And we even recovered charcoal from here. In season 2, we said we would take it down to bedrock. We haven't reached bedrock yet. So that gives you an idea. Trench 3, we had a partially exposed burial eroding out of the slope. Because when the rains do come, they can be quite bad. This was sort of a bit of a rescue excavation. We had to remove the skeleton. And despite this one being at risk and all that, it ended up giving us a lot of interesting osteoarchaeological data, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So just as a warning, the next slide contains an image of human remains. There is our body. The individual was supine, facing right with the hands between the legs. Assemblage 3 sherds were in direct association, as were microliths, ostrich eggshell, and freshwater shells. Our bioarchaeologists determines that the individual was likely aged between 24 and 27 at the time of death. No pathological changes were observed. The dentition was complete except for the lower central incisors. And here we come to a phenomenon where we find a number of teeth that were deliberately extracted. And the reason for this is people used to wear what we call lip plugs. And I give you a couple of examples here. These lip studs or lip plugs, in Wellcome's excavations, they found so many of these. And the idea is you remove a couple of teeth and then you can wear these, and you can wear, you can change them. People in life, what we know anthropologically at least, tend to wear a variety of these, and they don't necessarily wear them all the time, but for certain occasions. Then there's our trench 4. Again, you can see the strata there looking beautiful. And there we found a very beautiful quern. And we also found a number of animal bones. Now, the exciting thing from season 1 is that there was a number of radiocarbon dates, 6 AMS dates. We found, amongst other things, the second oldest domesticated sorghum in the world, I think, not just the continent. Now, the eagle-eyed among you might notice that one of our dates looks a bit funny, given that it's coming from spit 2, which is towards the top. And the reason for that is, and this is why archival work is so important, and we're so grateful to the Wellcome Trust for preserving these archives and making them available. That trench where we got that date is at the edge of Wellcome's vast camp. I mean, see how enormous that camp is. And our trench was somewhere exactly at the edge of it. And so there's a little bit of stratigraphic disturbance there, of course. So if we wanted to look at the chronology as it stands now, we have these different phases. And for those of us who don't follow the Western calendar, these events happen a very, very long time before the Prophet's Hijrah, which would be 622 AD in the Gregorian calendar. You'll also notice that I've put terms like Mesolithic in inverted commas, because, and this is perhaps a discussion for another time, but you know, anyone who works on the African continent knows that these terms that arose from Paleolithic archaeology in Europe and mostly France are not terribly helpful in this context. Now, in terms of the flotation, sorghum is the most common thing that we find, and sorghum remains a staple crop even now. You can see the date of range that we have from the AMS remains. The domestication of sorghum is interesting because it's one of the most important crops worldwide. But its domestication is less well documented overall. So we have Dorian Fuller and Chris Stevens who are working on our botanical samples. We also found fruit stones from the Sisyphus or Jujube, as it's called, fragments of nutshell, and then the one marked H on the slide, we have some panicoid grasses, small legumes, etc., and also a number of weedy taxa that would have been used as fuel, and they would have come to us through animal dung mostly. Now, Kevin MacDonald is the one analysing the faunal remains. We have some interesting things here, and we're still at the beginning of this analysis. We find cattle, goats, probably sheep, just about everywhere. We also find antelope and waterbuck, so Cobus cob, present in Trench 1, Spit 4. And this is interesting because these animals are highly territorial, and they also require permanent water sources. And neither of these animals has been recorded in the area in the recent history or in the present. And, you know, this is one of these things. Jebel Moya really means mountain of water, Maya being water. And people ask us, Fein el Maya, where's the water? But the only water source currently is a reservoir a few kilometers away. Kevin also identified an elephant molar, and again, these are found across a number of sites in Sudan. The ecological requirements for antelopes and waterbuck attest to weather conditions than present. They would have need grassy savanna plains and some forest, and you know, those particular ones date to the 1st millennium BC. But then Kevin also found some gazelle, and that one is dated a bit later. And the presence of that gazelle suggests the current Sahelian semi-arid grasslands by the mid-1st millennium BC. So as you can see, there was a fairly rapid change in climate there. And of course, this is something that we're still exploring because no one has really traced this in the southern Gezira and the particular part that we're in. So our future investigations are focusing on the changing environment and the changing climate and its relationship to population, health, and movement. Now, it's also interesting because we have some carbon isotope data, which pretty much agree with this broad picture. But before I go to that, I just wanted to point out there's a number of animal figurines that were found in the Welcome excavations. And you can see a number of animals. Don't be distracted by number 9. Number 9 is a modern bit of pipe that was misidentified by Reisner and company. But I just wanted to show you, and you know, there should be some work of mine coming out soon on these figurines. And okay, here we have some teeth, which we used for carbon isotopes. And I think what's interesting is that the oxygen isotope values fall near the median range for Neolithic bovids and fish from the site of Al-Qidai, where our colleague Donatella is excavating. And what's interesting is they have a very good isotope database available. And from them we learned that at the time, the White Nile's temperature was on average 13 degrees lower than the present. So again, this gives us much scope for work, which we will be pursuing in this respect. But now over to season 2.
Before I continue on that, I just want to give a thanks else to, there's another person on this call, Ivana, and she's our bioanthropologist. And without her, a large portion of the data that we're presenting just wouldn't be possible. So just a public thank you. In summary, the results to date from the 2017 season have substantially changed what is known about Jebel Moya, and in particular has impacted upon the date and debate of the domestication of sorghum. A new dating framework has also been established. Apart from its impact on the picture for the spread of early African agricultural domesticates, the site now more broadly serves as a unique reference point for all future work in the central and southern Gezira. Excavations continued in 2019, including a new walk-in survey of the valley, which enabled us to assess the conditions of preservation of previous trenches, identify areas at risk of erosion, and clarify the overall picture of the site. In the 2019 season, 5 new trenches were excavated and 1 continued from 2017. The aims were to continue carrying out systematic sampling where substantial archaeological deposits remain, build upon last season's work, and to investigate more human burials. Decision was made to resume excavating Trench 2 in an effort to reach bedrock.
What happened?
And thereby have the first complete occupational sequence in the central and southern Gezira plain. By the close of the second season, it had been excavated to a depth of 2.4 meters without hitting sterile deposits or the bedrock. It continues to be the richest trench in terms of any kind of finds. We also documented what appears to have been a living floor at the boundary between the so-called Mesolithic and Neolithic layers. This slide shows the top of a dried mud wall. Part of the top of the right of the semicircular wall has a small round depression in which a rib bone was found. And obviously, as has been said so many times, we'll continue excavating next season. This, trench number 6, was open to explore the stratigraphic integrity of the deposits north of where Wellcome had stopped his excavations in the northeast sector. It is located halfway between the House of Boulders in the north of the valley and where Wellcome stopped. Remember, the northeast sector of Wellcome's expedition is where the highest concentration of rich human burials were located. The boundary line where Wellcome stopped his excavations is currently marked by a low-slung rock wall, and the ground between it and the House of Boulders to the north, again, was occupied by his expedition camp. The first 2 layers of this trench, like those of Trench 1, were mixed due to this encampment. The pottery sherds, however, from the later spits are highly interesting. These sherds are classified as Neolithic and significantly expand the range of variability beyond that seen in the British Museum and indeed the Petrie Museum's collections, and from the 2017 season's collection as well. As detailed in an in-press journal article, there are resemblances between some of the Jebel Moya Neolithic sherds and sherds from the central Sudan above cartoon. Now, just a quick warning, the next few slides are of skeletal remains.
And again, these were all also analyzed by Ivana, and I know there's a bit more work to be done with these, but you'll see we're getting
all in the course of time. Now, this trench number 8, it is just 20 meters north of trench number 3 from the first field season in the center of the valley. 2 human remains were found. This is one of them, skeleton 1 on screen. They're from the same geological strata as at trench number 3. For this skeleton 1, there was an almost continuous stretch of rock in the western portion, and the cranium was deliberately placed on the stretch of rock. The rest of the body was laying on sandy soil. Its teeth, mandible, and maxilla are present. The face was orientated due south, and the body lay west to east. The lower legs and feet were not present. As the body was excavated, other lithics, faunal remains, sherds, shell, and ostrich eggshell were found. This male individual was aged approximately 25 to 35 years at the time of death. At the base of the skeleton 1, there was skeleton 2. It was incomplete, poorly preserved, and fragmented. However, Ivana was able to determine that it was likely an adult female aged 35 or slightly older. Immediately to the right of this trench number 8 was trench 10. There are indications of post-depositional disturbance. The bones were light, and some, apart from the cranium, had shifted leftwards to end up over the right side of the skeleton 1 in trench 8. The frontal sinuses are not formed yet, so the subadult was likely around 6 years or just slightly older at the time of death. Ostrich eggshell, lithics, and pottery sherds were in association, and a microlithic arrowhead was nearby, also in association. Trench number 9 was an estimated 30 to 35 meters southwest of trench number 2. The body was deposited in the same stratum as the other human skeletons. This body was orientated north to west. Sorry, it was just orientated northwest. The teeth were in excellent condition. The cranium was present but fragmented, held together by the pressure of the surrounding and infilled soil. The mandible was robust, but it was also fragile. The postcranial skeleton was unfortunately fragmentary. Now, this individual had an interesting pathology. 2 small depressions were noted on the frontal bone and above the orbits. The depression observed on the left frontal bone could be a healed trauma from a projectile. During excavation, a small microblade was found by the right eye socket and a second lithic on the chest. The age of the individual was estimated from permanent teeth to be between 30 to 45 years of age. As the mastoid process was also very robust and large, the individual was likely a male. Now, overall, the 2019 season focused on the Neolithic and the Mesolithic occupations. Current geological data suggests that the southern Gezira became inhabitable during the second half of the 6th millennium BC. Previously, large swamps were much reduced in size. Whether domesticated animals were present during the first occupations is as yet unknown. Animal bones from the lowest stratum were observed in a gully, and this is one of the unresolved questions which may be answered by the continued excavation and expansion of trench number 2. The late Mesolithic pottery from trench number 2, also the subject of the aforementioned impress pottery paper, extends the variability seen in the British Museum and the National Museum and Cartoons collections. Now, after the late Mesolithic, late 6th millennium BC, the next and first radiometric dated occupation currently recognized spans the early to late 3rd millennium BC. The first identified domestic animals and the first domesticated sorghum remains, as we've said, are from this period. More information on the ecology and food remains will be available once the materials retrieved from this season are examined. They're currently in Khartoum, and COVID disrupted their transportation through to the UK. Samples from 3 of the skeletons have been sent off for radiocarbon dating and ancient DNA, carbon, and oxygen isotope analysis. Should the AMS dates return early dates, they will confirm an emerging hypothesis that extensive burial activity started much earlier than the late 1st millennium BC model, which I proposed in my PhD thesis. One major challenge will be to reconstruct the distribution and nature of these multi-phase burials. In this light, a new site survey was conducted at the end of the 2nd season. 2 locations in the west with potentially long sequences have been identified for their visual potential to yield both human and animal bones and pottery amongst other material remains. This would return the initial focus back to the later occupation phases before mirroring trench number 2 and proceeding down into the Neolithic and Mesolithic strata over the next couple of seasons. At the same time, the mobile unit excavating human skeletal remains will continue, and 2 further promising localities with visual human remains and associated grave goods have been identified in the center of the valley.
And we are getting towards the end of this, but I just want to say, when we started this project, it's interesting, both of us come from former colonies, I suppose, and we wound up together, and we were determined, because of the experience in our own countries with our own archaeology, that from the outset, this project would be with the cooperation, blessing, and participation of the current village of Jebel Moya. And I have to say, we've been welcomed and people are so engaged with what we are doing. And honestly, it's a home away from home. And it's hard to describe sitting here at a desk, the sense of how far it is from the rest of our days, kind of. We're really far down in the south, in Sudan. You go from the chaos that is Khartoum and then down to this place and sort of, you know, when you can sit there in the evening and watch the Milky Way in all its glory. And so, you know, we spend a lot of time here in this little piazza, talking, eating. This is Fatah al-Rahman, one of the village elders, who is also a medical man and also really involved in our project. We've also had the absolute pleasure of working with the many children in the community. And these are some of the drawings which I have kept. They're treasured and they will be part, and they are forming part of our excavation archive. So just by way of conclusion, this project is something that's brought a lot of reflection. The Nigerian author Chinua Achebe reminds us the colonial policy of knowing the native was tied to the idea that the native is simple and can be controlled. The history of Jebel Moya, the Sudan, colonial Africa is tethered to the idea of knowing the native. And it's only in the last decade that people are finally listening to Sudanese voices. And I'm proud to say that our Sudanese team is full of people who make their voice heard and who've been part of the revolution in Sudan. And they're really bright lights for the future. We miss you. I'll end by saying this. When Julian Uribe was packing up, he wrote, "For the last time, I am out amongst my Sudanese friends, whom God may help us in ages past. For as far as we are concerned, they are to be forsaken. The house of boulders shall be abandoned to a sad fate. Sibilant snakes and the most vicious of ants will glory in the perfect floors. Ghastly, monstrous lizards will dart upon the capricious walls in search of prey. Bats and owls will make of the halls the parade ground, crowding the upper regions with their silent, uncanny wings and filling the atmosphere with offensive screeches. The cellars will be populated by dreadful ghosts and afrits. People will not dare, and with reason, to enter its portals." Well, we did enter the portals, Sergio. The current expedition is co-directed by a Sudanese and a South African, and there's a Maltese somewhere in the mix. From the outset, Sudan has been at the core of our ethos, and our portals remain wide open. So that's it from us. Please do follow us, join us on Facebook and follow our blog. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both so much for the presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. For me, it was a completely new project. I'd never hadn't read up about it before. So, and you gave a lot of information. I have got a couple of questions from the floor, so to speak.
Of course, as many as you like.
One question I'd like to ask myself, you may have answered this and I missed it, I'm sorry, but if you have, but Wellcome himself, as far as methodology is concerned, how would he be viewed today? How would his methodology be viewed today, given that it was just, the new museology was turning a little bit at the beginning of the century?
Good old Henry himself didn't exactly pick up a trowel. What he did was he hired a bunch of Egyptian excavators. This is something that is being studied in Egyptology. You know, the Egyptian workmen who are written out of the narrative of Egyptology, they're the ones who did all the work, really, and they were experienced. He also hired a number of Americans and Europeans to direct the excavations. I'd say the most meticulous were when Reisner was there, wouldn't you say, Mike?
Yeah, so it evolved very much, and bearing in mind that the mass of workers that you saw there on the screen was because Wellcome thought of a policy of just employing everybody who actually asked to join the project. The first season was relatively small. It did last for some 4 months. The second season was when it began to take off. And in the third season, that was when Reisner happened to join, because Wellcome decided that he wanted a more experienced person to come in and just basically check that they were doing what they wanted to do. Reisner made various recommendations. He was telling them to go slower. As you saw, there's quite a few heavy machines and they were really going at it. So their descriptions, when they were writing the grave cards and everything, were actually quite accurate. But the problem is they were shifting so much soil that there would have been stuff that had been lost. Yeah. And so Reisner said, slow down, let's try and see if we can see any microstratigraphy across the site. And at the time with Reisner coming on board, he had brought his Egyptian supervisors effectively with him. And that's where they entered the archaeological record of the Sudan in terms of the expedition. And the local people, they weren't trusted to be trench supervisors in any shape or form, or to actually do the recording. The recording at first was done by the white men, and then it was handed through to the Egyptian supervisors in charge for the trenches. But in effect, what you had by the end of that fourth season in 1914, in April 1914, when he closed, is you had over 4,000 people employed on this particular project. Now, this was everything from transportation, of goods from Senna on a railway to Jebel Moya, to cooking, to doing things on the plain, which is where you saw the encampment, to people actually excavating. And given what we've seen at the site, I would reckon only if, I say only in inverted commas, we're probably only talking about 300 to 400 people on the site, but still that had the potential to cause quite significant damage in the parts. So he was able to go very fast. When they did find a skeleton, thankfully they did call on two of the bioanthropologists who were there. They were literally running from trench to trench recording, but at least they did a reasonable job of the actual recording. Their identification, though, in terms of the sexing, was less methodical, but there was enough of a record to be able to reconstruct some behavior that was going on at the site and to be reasonably confident that that was a coherent record.
And the photography seems to be, as you said in the presentation, quite avant-garde.
Yes, that it was at the forefront of photography.
In fact, I wanted to say there's also, and I see Angela Soward is here, and she's from the Wellcome Trust who's looked into this. We have, Wellcome got a camera, and there are films of the excavation there, and it's a miracle they survived because they're made of rather explosive material. You can view them on the Wellcome collection site, and they're also posted on our blog. If you like, after this, I'll post a link on the Facebook page of the society so people can see it. But yes, there are, and we were looking at them and they're really quite interesting. Yeah, and a lot of film from that era just doesn't survive because of its material, and yes. But they're digitized, so you can view them without exploding.
Great, that's great. And a question I'm seeing on the chat. So what were the criteria with regard to determining richer from poorer burials? How far?
That's me, back to the PhD.
Yes.
One of the things that I had to consider was that the time of deposition of a particular item can be very far removed, particularly in this part of the world, from its time of manufacture. I mean, to take an argument, there is, in the Central Sahara, there is an item that was deposited there some 300 years after the estimated date of its manufacturer from the Nile Valley. It had made all its way across. And there are issues to do with imitations that have been made. And there's well-known examples of other artifacts which have been heirlooms, etc., and later removed from the everyday life of people to be deposited. So I decided to take a very different approach. I looked at the source provenance of the raw materials that the grave goods were made of. And the idea behind was that there might be some form of prestige attached to these raw materials. So a material that was made, an artifact that was made of local raw material, either from the mountain, which is granite, or from the surrounding plain, or from the blue or white Niles, they were given a particular score. And they were given a very low score. But an item made of a material from far away, and this could be either from the Red Sea itself, or it could be from sources just below Khartoum, or sources beyond Khartoum, in which case we're getting into the Meroitic state, or other states if it came from further north. And therefore that was distance, and there's going to be some form of prestige that's been attached to something that was relatively, I'm not saying impossible, but relatively difficult to obtain. And if you're going to take an item like that out of circulation in the population, there's going to be a damn good reason for it. Sure. And there's any number of ethnographic examples of this from West Africa, and reasonings that are attached to it, from a family that could actually be rich themselves and wanting to display this, to a family that's not so rich, but the member has been influential in the society for some reason, and they wanting to portray themselves as richer than they actually are. So this was an expression, this was a particular expression through mortuary rites of the person's status in the mortuary realm. Now, I've always had to be careful because the reflection in mortuary realm doesn't necessarily mean that this person was a bigwig in everyday life. So I looked at this entire range, and the majority of the burials either don't have grave goods or are very poor in terms of the grave goods themselves. And there's some interesting distributions which were beyond the scope of this talk and indeed the time limits to show. So I went to where a differentiation was most compelling. And I developed something that was called an inverse distance analysis. Some fancy terms, no need to really go into it. And it was on the basis of the extraction of a lot of these items made from materials that were further away that I based on richer and poorer burials. Say, for example, if there was a burial that had 20 items made from an artifact that was beyond Khartoum, that is going to be of more significance and have a greater IDV number than a burial that is full of just local shells because somebody was buried wearing a necklace. It's on that basis that the richer and poorer burials were determined.
Great. That's there's a question here about the trench sediments have great alluvial soils. I'm wondering, this is the person who's asking, I'm wondering whether the bedrock and boulders are granites.
Yes, now
I wanted to answer. Sorry, because I saw a question somewhere from Dawn about the post-colonial issue, and that Angela mentioned an upcoming talk to the Wellcome Trust. So for those of you who are interested in the in this colonial issue and other broader ethical discussion, I'll be giving a talk hosted by the Wellcome next year in March, and we will make that available. We will advertise that and tell you all about it on our Facebook page. So we'll maybe talk about that then. So Mike can talk about sediments because he's really keen to talk about sediments. Sorry.
His eyes lit up. So tell us.
Your question there does relate to also a question that Yusuf had asked in terms of environmental sampling. We've discerned the macro geological strata of the site and confirmed a lot of what Wellcome and his field archaeologists had claimed. Now, there's an issue to do with the microstratigraphy of the site and the microsite formation processes. And those are matters that we're going to delve into in the subsequent field seasons. First, we needed to go back to stage one. And now that we have got the framework in place for the site, we can take the necessary environmental samples and have a look at those microstratigraphic issues. And by that, what I mean is somewhere, say in stratum B, there could have been just some flooding for one rainy season, and it could have taken away then maybe about 2 or 3 centimeters, I'm just using this as an example, 2 or 3 centimeters of the then modern ground surface. And these are just the issues that we will be grappling with. Now, very interestingly, as we went further down into the Mesolithic in trench number 2, there is in fact some visual evidence there of some alluvial movement from wetter conditions. And that's something I very much want to be exploring in the next season.
Yes.
You want to say something, Isabelle?
Oh no, I saw a question about the isotopes. Hi, Peter. So at the moment, we have more isotope stuff coming up, but it's held up in Khartoum.
If you take a look at the Azania December 2019 issue, that contains all the current data. It is a carbon isotope, and there's some oxygen isotope data in there as well.
Yes, so what we have so far, Peter, we've published in full, put in the Jebel Moya project.wordpress.com. Sorry. So you can, oh, look what I've done. Hang on, send to everyone in meeting. So you can find our publications there. And we also have our Facebook page. So it's just facebook.com/Jebel Moya. So Father Eugene had a question as well. There we go.
Well, there were quite a few. In fact,
Sorry, we can't keep up from this end. All right, tell us.
Eugene is saying any information regarding the geography and geology of the region, especially regarding the region previous to the first millennium BCE.
Now there is, but it's quite varied in terms of archaeological data. That very much comes from Donatello's site at Archaeology, as that's just a bit south of Khartoum, and at least 230 kilometers to the north of Jebel Moya. However, in the late 1970s to early 1980s, there was a geological mission which was exploring the southern Gezira, in fact, looking at the geology of the entire Gezira. And that has been published quite extensively. And one of the participants, Martin Williams, who is based in Australia, has been doing a lot more recent work over the last decade, but his geological work in terms from the Blue Nile and the White Nile is focusing much more on the end of the Pleistocene and the early Holocene, rather than coming right down into the middle Holocene and in the vicinity of Jebel Moya. So we are going to, once we've actually got better environmental data coming in the next 2 field seasons, and after Kevin has finished his faunal analysis from these 2 seasons that have gone by, we're going to attempt to be bridging that gap.
I also wanted to point out something. By the way, the DNA analysis, we're waiting for our colleague at the Crick Institute.
Yeah, we're hoping to have that before Christmas, but given recent COVID events in the UK, this could very well extend into the first quarter of next year.
And we still have samples, and I'm itching to go to Khartoum and bring our samples, and anyway.
And what we're waiting for is from the first season and a couple of samples through from the second season, and even if those are unsuccessful, hopefully we'll be able to get that from subsequent field seasons.
I just wanted to point out something about this. So for a long time, everyone said Jebel Moya is really remote. I'm just going to share my screen with you again for a moment, if you'll indulge me. Okay, so here you have the details if you want to join our Facebook page and our blog. But if we go back to the map, there's this idea. This map doesn't quite give you the sense of scale and of distance, but there's this idea that this site is remote, no one ever went there, and that this mountain is this big sort of blocky thing over there that is so dominant. And it is dominant, but what people don't notice is that on the other side of the mountain, there's a whole other life. And there's a number of people who are technically part of the Jebel Moya broader community, but it's a bit like Malta and Gozo, you know, if they're part of the same area or not. But there are very mobile sheep herders there and goat herders who would come down to the site practically every day because we are part of their sort of pathway. But also, at a certain point, this part of the world was a corridor, not a liminal place, because people from neighboring countries would use it to cross either as they were going to and from their Hajj pilgrimage, also a number of trading routes. So it's actually, it looks so quiet and remote, but it's actually a really active landscape and has always been. And its marginalization is really due to people's perceptions of space and distance. Look, it's not that different from people who look at Maltese archaeology and say, how come you have so many big temples on a tiny island? But what landscape means and how people experience it differs greatly.
To pick up on a couple of those points, if you see the cursor moving, these words, the Atbai River. Now, a little bit further from the Atbai River, probably around here, you've got a town called Kassala. And just a little bit outside of Kassala is an ancient site called KG23. It's now called something else, but I'm just going to use the old name for it. And at that site, that is where the oldest domesticated sorghum has been located.
We're number 2.
And this was another project which I've been involved with. I was coordinating, getting different people together. And that sorghum is from around 3,500 BC. It was the subject of a current anthropology paper 2 years ago, and the subject of a Journal of Archaeological Science paper, which has just come out with Dorian Fuller. And what is very interesting at that point, I say 3,500, but it's anywhere between 3,500 and 3,000 BC, is that the Jebel Moya sorghum is far more advanced in its domestication stage than what is present by the Atbai River. And sorghum isn't a plant or cereal really, which can undergo a very quick domestication. Dorian estimates that it would have needed at least 1,000 years of what he calls pre-domestication going through. And he would suspect that the first time that there was control over sorghum, and I'm not talking about the managed, which we see at sites like Nubta Playa, which is further north within Egypt at quite an earlier stage. He uses very specific type of terminology. And so we're probably looking at around 4,500 BC for when sorghum was first domesticated. I'm just using popular terminology in this case. Now, what all of this means is that there is potential at Jebel Moya in the earlier phases for us to maybe help bridge that particular gap that's being seen. I'm not saying that sorghum was domesticated in the area of Jebel Moya, not by any stretch, because I do think its likely area was around the Atbai River. But we do have a potential, and Dorian needs to verify this, a potential or earlier sorghum sample coming through notes. If he does verify that, its own date would be interesting. Now, further to this is the position of Jebel Moya right here. And what I'm about to say is something that I do believe in, but it is quite controversial.
No.
The introduction of pastoralism through into Ethiopia was occurring around about this time, and they all believe that it was a migratory introduction to go through into Eritrea and the Ethiopian highlands, and that this would have come further from the west in the Sahelian belt. Now, this could have come through a bit through lower South Sudan, but also it means that Jebel Moya right there was sitting, in my view, probably in the center of that type of migration path. And this is where I believe that the ancient DNA, if we are successful, will prove to be highly valuable in the long term, because one sample does not mean anything.
And in fact, I mean, listen, if we look at later historical data on journeys people undertake in that area, it's not an impossible thing. So really, we really want to explore this question of population movement and health in this part of the world. I'll put the screen away so I can see the chat again.
Sorry, I've been talking for a long time.
As you can tell, we're very excited by it.
We're very interested to hear what you have to say. There are some links that have been placed on the chat, which I think possibly...
Yes, oh, thank you, William, yes.
They can be put, if they're of interest, general interest, could be put on your Facebook page or something like that. You could, if you feel that would be appropriate. Unfortunately, I think we ought to close at this point. We could go on listening to you for much longer, of course.
Well, if people have questions and they'd like to contact us or follow us on our Facebook page, which would be, let me just type it in the chat, facebook.com/Jebel Moya. Please do feel free to get in touch or drop us a line. And we're so happy that so many of our colleagues and friends from all over the world joined us today. It's really special. Well, thank you, Patricia, and the Society for making this happen. I mean, you know, guys, for those of you who are not Maltese, these lovely people have been supporting archaeologists since forever. And most of us who are trained in Malta, I think we gave, my first ever public talk was for the Archaeological Society. And I was terrified. I was terrified. And I've been back a few times since. So, you know, thank you, because this work that you do is so important.
Well, that's what we feel, you know, we're all about. I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this evening's event, and we look forward to seeing everybody again for the 9th of December at 6 p.m. and our speaker on that occasion will be Dr. Petros Shatsimpaloglu, who is postdoc researcher at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and his talk will be entitled Provenance Investigation of Stone Tools and the Position of Malta in the Neolithic Network of the Central Mediterranean Sea. Rather a long title, but you can find more details on our website, which is www.archsoc.org.mt.
And those of you who want to hear more about Jebel Moya, keep an eye out for the March 21st event that will be hosted by the Wellcome Trust.
Excellent. If anybody is interested in joining the Archaeological Society, please do visit our website. And in that way, you will be supporting the Society in its work and its lecture program, its peer-reviewed journal, which is starting up again online and will be launched shortly. And also the advocacy work that we do in support of all things archaeological in Malta. Sincere thanks to the ASM, from ASM to the Department of Classics and Archaeology, the ASM and the Department of Archaeology, to you both for being kind enough to give us this lovely presentation this evening. We look forward to seeing you again, and a very good night to everyone. Thank you so
very
much.
Very
good. Great stuff.